on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
Even though you maybe have a hustle-bustle kind of life, you can still connect with the earth. You can still develop those relationships with the gifts that are there for us to eat.
To see the world in that bigger way, he's like, wow, I really have to take a step down. Maybe I'm not the center.
Manoomin, the Anishinaabeg word for wild rice, translates to good berry.
An incredibly rich, evolved, adapted food source.
Wild rice is a grass, and it's an annual plant, so it has to reseed itself. It does develop a seed bank. Those seeds were viable 15 years.
You have a contingent who would like to restore the earth and the human relationship to it. And then you have a contingent that would use every last living thing here as fuel to send rocket ships into space.
It's for us to have to sustain us, not to hoard and take as much as we possibly can. Know that this is a gift. This is not a resource. This is a gift.
Episode number 69 of the WildFed podcast, Manoomin, the gift of wild rice with Barb Barton, is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival's annual colostrum sale is on now and going strong. All colostrum products are 20% off with the coupon code HEALTHY2021. Colostrum is a sophisticated antiviral immune-boosting superfood that's well known for its digestive tract regenerating properties, as well as its ability to assist in workout recovery and lean muscle growth. I use Surthrival colostrum just about every day in my morning smoothie. In fact, once you start using colostrum in blended drinks, nothing else comes close to giving you the flavor and texture. It's a delicious and truly functional food. Get over to surthrival.com and check out the entire product line. And be sure to use the coupon code HEALTHY2021 to get 20% off all colostrum products. This episode of the WildFed podcast is also brought to you by Wild Food Warehouse. Are you looking for authentic, hand-harvested wild rice? Not that paddy-grown, overpriced stuff you see in the supermarket, but the naturally occurring, truly wild rice that's forager harvested under Minnesota's strict ricing laws? Wild Food Warehouse delivers hand-foraged, wood-fire parched wild rice direct to your door. You can even use the coupon code WildFed and get an additional 10% off your order. Wild rice, as you'll hear in this interview, is more than just a healthy, gluten-free grain. It's a sacred food that was and is a staple for the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region, where it's still hand-harvested from canoes today. Some of that rice is brought to market, and now you can get your own. Go over to wildfoodwarehouse.com and use the coupon code WILDFED to get truly wild rice delivered direct to your door. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Today I'm talking with Barb Barton, author of the wonderful book Manoomin, The Story of Wild Rice in Michigan. Barb's an endangered species biologist, so she comes to the conversation with a classical Western scientific education, but she's also a forager who works alongside indigenous folks in her area, so she brings some of that traditional bioregional land-based knowledge as well. So along with what she's sharing with us about wild rice, or what the Anishinaabeg call Manoomin, we'll also be getting the perspective of someone who's been trained to see the world through the lens of endangered species biology, which, as you can imagine, gives her a very unique perspective on the current state of the natural world. Either of these perspectives is really valuable on their own, but the two together is a powerful combination. There's also some really interesting conversation about the differences between English as we currently speak it and some of the indigenous languages of North America, and how those languages shape our worldview, particularly how we see animals, plants, and other life forms in our ecosystem. Are they simply resources for our exploitation, or are they relatives to be approached with gratitude and reverence? Barb Barton, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. I'm really excited to talk about all things wild.
I'm excited too. And I got your name from our mutual friend, Debbie McSweeney, who was really singing your praises and telling me about the wonderful things you're involved in. But as I looked more into you, it's like you do a lot of different things. So maybe give us a synopsis of what your work looks like today and kind of the different things you're involved in. And then I'd like to hone in on the wild food projects that you do.
Sure. A lot of people have been calling me a Renaissance woman lately because I just have so many interests and passions, and I follow each one of them like equally, I would say. But my educational background is went to MSU, Michigan State University and got a bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife management, and then later on a master's in ecology, and worked in endangered species biology as my day job for many years. And right now I work in water quality for the Department of Transportation here in Michigan. I'm also a singer songwriter. I've been playing guitar since I was 5 years old and
Wow.
have 6 CDs out. I'm also a writer. Got a couple of books out, one on wild rice, or Manoomin as it's called here in the Great Lakes, and one called The Amazing Adventures of a Midwestern Girl. I do a
What's
lot
that
of
book about?
that book is actually a collection of autobiographical short stories, and I've had some pretty amazing adventures in over my lifetime with the work that I do, and following my passions. And so I kind of liken it to Reader's Digest. Like, it's a great book to either go to bed by because they're really short stories, so you can read a few and feel good or laugh or cry, or keep it in the bathroom. It's another great place for it.
Mhm.
But people really love it, especially people my age. I'm 62, and people my age can relate to a lot of the stories
Okay.
of growing up times, things that we used to do back in the day. Um, but I'm also an activist. I've done a lot of work in Flint during the water crisis. I,
Mhm.
I started a group called Love from Lansing, and we're just basically a bunch of folks. Actually, most of them don't even live here in Lansing. They live in cities and towns around central Michigan. But we would do water drives and take fresh drinking water to the folks there, and still are doing that. It's slowed down a bit, obviously, because of COVID. Um, what else? Oh, filmmaker. I did a documentary short called Water, and it is about the water crisis and a song that I wrote of the same name. And we recorded that with Flint's Gospel Choir, Albert Strickland and Chosen.
Oh, wow.
So that hit the film festival circuit over the past year, and was actually official selection for 4 or 5 of those, which was,
Congratulations.
yeah, it was quite surprising to me. So I'm kind of pursuing the filmmaking a lot more now.
It's a
Um,
powerful medium, isn't it?
it is. It is. I kind of liken it to writing instrumental music. Um, if I'm really moved by something and I want to write a song about it, putting lyrics down into a song is very hard for me for some reason. I can write a poem, that's not so hard, but the lyrics and the music, I struggle. And so I tend to um, lean toward instrumental and instrumental guitar stuff. And I feel like I can put a lot more emotion without having to worry about words. And I
Mm.
get that same kind of feeling when I'm doing film, especially if I'm just doing nature shots or nature photography. I love to put that to music and create movement in someone,
Mhm.
just because of the beauty of what you see out in nature, and then the powerful connection that music has with the soul.
Yeah.
I also do obviously, wild foods gathering. I've done that my whole life, and that's a real passion of mine. I'm actually working on a new book right now on wild foods here in Michigan, but it's not really a how to book or a field guide. It's more similar to kind of what you promote here on your show, is relationship, our relationship with wild foods and with the earth. That's really the focus of the book. And it covers a year of gathering. I mean, as you can imagine, I'm a pretty busy person, but my calendar um, falls with the Earth's calendar. So, wild food gathering and processing is my first priority above all else.
That's
And
great to
I'm
hear.
yeah, and so I'm able to do a lot all year long, as busy as I am and as many interests as I have. And so I do have a lot of information on how to do certain things that will be in the book. But it's really to show folks that even though you maybe have a hustle bustle kind of life, you can still connect with the earth. You can still develop those relationships with the gifts that are there for us to eat.
What led you to wild foods in the first place? How did that journey start for you? Because obviously we live in a culture where very few people really encounter, outside of maybe, occasionally picking some berries or doing like a you pick at apple place or something like that. Most people
Mhm.
don't really ever encounter it. So, well, what led you there?
Well, I would say it's kind of a parallel path. I was about, I don't know, 5, 6 years old. And my family at that time lived in northern Indiana. My dad was in college. My parents were pretty young when I was born. And we lived in these old CCC barracks, Civilian Conservation Corps barracks. And I would explore, but I never went behind the barracks. That just seemed a little scary to me because I
Hmm.
was always off wandering around by myself. Well, one late summer, early fall day, I decided I was going to be brave and go behind the barracks. And I saw, looked like old field kind of stuff. And I'm walking along, and all of a sudden I see this round red ball on the ground. And I got closer and looked, and it was a tomato. And as I was like, you know, looking around in these tangled, massive plants, I found a cucumber. And I saw this frilly looking plant coming up out of the ground, and I pulled it, and it was a carrot. And that was the first time I knew that where food came from, believe it or not.
How
And
old did you say you were?
I was like 5 or 6.
Yeah.
I was filled with like the most incredible rush. Like this was magical to me, just magical. So I got this wooden board I saw laying out there, and I set up a little feast with my tomato and my cucumber and my carrot. And I felt so independent and connected to the land in that moment, even though I was just a little girl. I still have that exact same feeling today if I find something in the wild to eat. Exactly the same amount of passion. And that I feel so blessed to experience that. My family, um, back for generations, they were hunters, mushroom hunters, big mushroom hunters. So my grandparents, my great grandparents, my own parents would take me out morel hunting when I was, you know, very little. Um, they would hunt rabbit and squirrel. I don't recall them doing too much deer hunting at the time. My grandma taught me how to go fishing for panfish out in the lake using a cane pole. She taught me about hickory nuts because her house was in the middle of a forest that had hickory trees and sassafras trees. And she'd show me, don't eat these. They've got little holes and there's worms, that come out of those holes. And that was just, that was all I needed. And I just took off on my own with it. And I haven't stopped since.
Wow, that story you just told about finding that must have been in somebody's old garden or something, but
Yeah,
the
exactly.
the
Exactly.
the the way you described it, I've been doing this for a long time, talking to people about wild food for a while, but I think you just kind of with that little story summarized something for me in a really succinct way. It's that feeling of independence and connectedness that you were talking about. It's like it's so empowering. And
It is.
I love that feeling of like, it's like you could imagine maybe in the Reformation when it was like, wait a second, I don't have to, the priest doesn't have to pray for me. Like I can just pray to my God or something. Like I don't need an intermediary. It's
Right.
like, wait, I don't need all these intermediaries. I can pull the food right out of the ground. It's so like independence mixed with that empowerment. It's a really beautiful feeling.
It is. And I think it connects us to ourself. It's a lot of times people think about independence and it's more like, well, I don't need anybody else. I can do
Hmm.
this by myself. But it's not that at all. It's more about standing in our power. We are animals. And what a greater expression of being an animal than eating wild food, rather than going grocery shopping, right?
Yeah.
We're out
Yeah.
there. You're out there peeing in the woods,
Yeah.
you're, you're out there, looking around, making sure there's nothing out there that's gonna sneak up behind you, and you're looking for those, tasty mushrooms or fresh spring greens or whatever, and it's just a feeling of empowerment, and and the power comes from being part of the circle of life, and that's the only place for me that I experience that level of connection in that greater circle of life.
Yeah. And when you said about, that's a really important distinction about independence because, when you look at people whose life way was based on hunting and gathering around the world, they tend to be powerfully interdependent with one another. And
Mhm.
yet also without that same kind of dominant hierarchy we're used to where people are considered sovereigns. And so it's always really interesting with the European mindset when they would encounter peoples like that and couldn't understand how whoever was like they perceived was in charge wasn't actually in charge of anybody. They was
Mhm.
like they all could make their own decisions. So it's like you can be independent because you're empowered personally, but not necessarily that doesn't mean you don't need anyone. Of course you do. And
Right.
you want a good strong network, but it's beautiful when you can be sovereignly empowered inside that, right? And that feels like something that we don't really have even like good language for in our culture.
Right. Yeah, English is lacking in that for sure. And the time of COVID right now has really brought to light how important that is. I remember when COVID first hit, a lot of people were saying, "Oh my gosh, we don't have flour. There's no yeast. We can't make bread." Um, and I'm sitting here with my bucket full of einkorn grain because I mill my own flour. I have
Oh, wow.
sourdough starter, so I don't need yeast. Um, and all the things that people were starting to freak out about that they couldn't get. And I was very comfortable because I have it here. I don't have to go get flour. I don't have to go buy yeast because I use sourdough starter that I started from scratch and got from my grandma who got it in 1985,
Oh, wow.
and then
It's got some
and then but
lineage.
sharing that, yeah, but then sharing that,
Hmm.
um, I don't know how many starters of sourdough that I gave out during COVID, and everybody started coming back to those basics of, well, we'll make our own bread, and
Yeah.
I'll share the flour that I have that I mill up. It's all about just taking care of yourself and making sure you have what you need, but you also make what you need. And then you don't get stuck when something like this happens. I haven't quite figured out how to make toilet paper yet, but it's
But all those mullein leaves in the
I
summer at
was
least
just
are so
thinking that,
very
yeah.
fuzzy.
Yeah, I might have to start gathering those for the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
Yeah. Oh, I can really relate to that. And this has been, I keep telling people, I notice some people get a little offended with me, but I keep saying 2020 has been my best year ever. For
mhm,
me personally, I've had a fantastic year. And
mhm,
I think part of that's because, we can all choose how we respond to events. And,
mhm,
we choose what we let in and out of our minds and hearts and all of those things, but also because most of my passions take place in places that you don't have to worry about social distancing or masks or any of that. It's just like enjoying
mhm.
my time in nature, and
Yeah.
the same way I always would, except that people seem so much more receptive suddenly to the
Mhm.
ideas of it.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I would love to hear about your book, Manoomin, because as we talked a little bit before the interview about the wild ricing we do up here in Maine, and I've never come out to the Great Lakes region to learn there, so only know what I know from books and videos and things.
Mhm,
But we're kind of figuring it out here. We have much less dense stands, uh,
mhm.
and we don't really have that intact tradition. So I'm curious, not just, I would love to hear about your book, and I'd also love to hear your perspectives on wild rice, what you've learned, what you know about the history, anything you care to share about it.
Sure. Well, I'd start with telling your listeners the title of the book. It's called Manoomin, The Story of Wild Rice in Michigan. And Manoomin is the Anishinaabeg word for wild rice, translates to good berry. And the Anishinaabe are the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi tribes here. And what was really fascinating and sad to me about learning about wild rice is that I didn't know we ever had wild rice here in Michigan. With all my fancy degrees in conservation, how is it I never knew that there was wild rice here? And it boiled down to the fact that we've lost so much of it in Michigan. The tribal folks know about wild rice because it's so important to their culture. But the non tribal folks, I call it ecological amnesia. It's been gone for so long that people have forgotten, and the non tribal people have forgotten. And so, um, of course, I wouldn't know about it. Nobody talks about it. They talk about the prairies. We had prairies here, but not so much the wild rice beds. So it was back it's around 2007, 2008, something like that. I was working for MSU Extension, a program called Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And I wanted to work with the tribes on endangered species, try to find a way to share data, etc. And our tribal liaison mentioned that there was this fellow up in the western Upper Peninsula named Roger Labin, who was a member of the Lac Vieux Desert Band of Lake Superior Chippewa. He wanted to put on a traditional wild rice camp. And Nick, our liaison, said, this would be a great project for you to get involved in to start building some partnerships and building trust, because that's what it's all about. Working with the tribal folks is building trust. So I applied for a multicultural mini grant and was able to help fund this camp. Now, mind you, the first time I was to meet Roger to talk about this wild rice that I didn't know anything about, I had just come off of a week-long backpacking trip from Isle Royal, which is out in the middle of Lake Superior. And I was to meet him and another tribal person at a restaurant. I got to the restaurant, the other tribal person was there, but Roger was not to be found. I waited and I waited and I waited and I waited. I'd call him and he said, "Oh, yeah, I'm on an island right now doing water quality sampling. I'll be back. I'll be there soon." So it ended up being 5 hours later he shows up. Had I not waited all of that time, that book would never have been written. I would have
Wow.
never had the rich experiences since then with Manoomin. But he shared with me the cultural teachings, the traditional teachings of his people about Manoomin. And he was on a quest to bring rice back to the lake that his tribe lived on. Lac Vieux Desert was the name of the lake. His uncle,
Bring it back
Nagana,
to grow?
yeah, the rice disappeared from that lake. There was a dam put on it. It's the headwaters of the Wisconsin River. And there was a dam built back in the 1870s to basically turn the lake into a reservoir to facilitate running logs down the Wisconsin River
Mm.
during the logging era. When they raised that water level, the wild rice was drowned out.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very devastating to their culture in terms of ricing, right? And plus, they used it for food and ceremonies and all of that. So his uncle had a mission to bring rice back for his people. His uncle passed away from cancer and turned the responsibility over to Roger. And then Roger asked me to help him, um, especially statewide, with the non-tribal world and my position in state government, uh, so that we could try to bring rice conservation to the forefront here in Michigan. So I agreed. And um, when I first had that rice camp, that first rice camp with Roger, and went out ricing, I just fell in love. I just fell in love with that plant. You could tell how sacred that plant is just by being in its presence.
Hmm.
Probably your listeners um, don't know this, but the reason that wild rice or Manoomin is so important to the Anishinaabe people is that it's what basically it's the reason that they are here in the Great Lakes. So a long time ago, their stories tell that they used to live in what's now the northeastern United States, southeastern Canada, and they were visited by prophets and
So they would have been between whom the
like the
Abenaki Indians, and then whom else? Like they would have been to the east of the Iroquois.
yeah, they would have been up by St. Lawrence River,
Okay.
up
Wow.
in that section.
No kidding.
And yeah, and so the two of the prophets gave them two prophecies, and if you learn about these prophecies, they all came true. It's quite amazing story. But they were told that there were going to be people with white faces coming across the ocean on
Wow.
logs blown by the wind, and that if they didn't leave, they would be destroyed. And they were
Wow.
told to travel westward, following the Migas shell, and travel until they found the
Following what?
place Amigas shell,
Can you tell me what that is?
Megis. It's also called a cowrie shell. You might know it as a cowrie shell.
I don't.
These were they were to follow this. They would stop at these places where they would find these shells along the way, as I understand the story, and they would call those fires. So there was like 7 fires, and these were stopping points along their route to the Great Lakes. And this took several hundred years for them to make this journey. But when they got to the Great Lakes, they found Manoomin, the food that grows on water, and this is where they stopped and made their home. That's their that's their stories.
Huh.
So it's very very sacred to them here. The problem that's happened over time here is because of the boarding school era, where the U.S. government basically tried to kill the Indian, save the man. That was their policy, and took the kids from their homes, from their families, forcefully sometimes, and put them in these Christian boarding schools and stripped them of their culture. A lot of their traditions were interrupted, as well as the language. Right, they couldn't speak their language.
Hmm.
They were supposed to um, take English names. It was very devastating. That rising culture was interrupted, and
When you
not
said
only that,
your pronunciation, because I always hear Anishinaabe, but you're saying Anishinaabek.
Anishinaabeg is like plural, so you would
Okay.
say Anishinaabe people or Anishinaabeg.
Okay, great. And now is that you mentioned three specific tribes. Is this then a language group? They all share a same language root or something?
They share the same language root. Yeah, it's Algonquin's the bigger umbrella,
Oh, okay, got it.
um, but they call the language Anishinaabemowin,
Okay.
but they have dialects like the Odawa, um, the Potawatomi or Potawatomi. They have their own dialect, and then there's regional dialects too, depending
Okay.
where they're from. Where they're
Okay.
from. So yeah, so they got put on reservations as the European colonization happened here, and say they were removed from. Um, a lot of them were removed from their homelands. So not only did they have the cultural interruption from the boarding school era, but they also had the issue of being taken from the land that they knew. And I always talk about the Saginaw Chippewa tribe. They're historically they were a lot of villages of theirs were on the shores of Lake Huron in the Saginaw Bay, and there were lots of wild rice beds over there, like
Mm.
thousands and thousands of acres. And their reservation, the final reservation for them, the big one, is in the middle of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan in Isabella County, where there's hardly any wetlands at all, and no wild rice.
Okay.
So you have
They
that
were expected to farm,
physical.
I imagine.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what they expected them to do, but it was, going from hunting and fishing and being on the Great Lakes on these big coastal marshes to the middle of Isabella County. I mean,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that breaks my heart just thinking about,
Mhm.
losing that connection. They
I think
still
too,
have a
like, if
small.
you as somebody who forages yourself and interacts with wild food, you can kind of I mean, obviously, it's a very pale comparison, but it's like, I can imagine being just pushed out of the places that I utilize, and they're not places my family and my lineage and my people have, you know what
Right,
I mean? So, like, the
exactly.
idea of not being able to access some of those resources, yeah, I can feel that pretty viscerally when you describe it.
Yeah, and they still have Saganing, area over there, on the lake, so they still have, some tribal community over there, but the rice beds disappeared, so they lost that resource as well, they lost that
Mhm.
relationship. So all the tribes here have been, working hard to bring those traditions back and work on, restoration and introductions, reintroductions, trying to get that ricing culture going again, which has been really great to see. It's taken off in the last 10 years, I would say. Some of the tribes were planting rice before then, like back into the 90s, mostly for wildlife habitat. But
Okay, 'cause,
now,
here in Maine, our Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife, does the same thing for, waterfowl habitat, sort
yeah,
of.
yeah, yeah. So we don't in Michigan. We don't have, only maybe a handful of places that are large enough beds to harvest from.
Mhm.
And it's quite heartbreaking. We used to have beds that were literally 4,000 acres
Oh, wow.
in size,
Yeah.
at the mouths of the rivers that empty into the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie, Lake Huron on the eastern side of our lower peninsula, and some on Lake Michigan. The mouths of those rivers, there's a lot of, wild rice beds there, and some very large ones. And in the 1800s, the Corps of Engineers decided, we need to go in and dredge all these so that we can open up shipping and yada, yada, yada.
Wow.
And that was the end of that.
The
Um,
plant is reliant on a pretty like the seed bank is important, right? Because they don't
mhm.
just germinate every year. They accumulate a seed bank. Is that true?
Yeah, yeah. Rice, wild rice is a grass, and it's an annual plant, so it has to reseed itself. But it does, develop a seed bank, and, um, it's quite interesting. We used to talk about how long do the seeds stay viable in the sediment. So if you think about like the Great Lakes, they go through these high and low water cycles. And as I was doing the research for the book, I was finding that Manoomin was mentioned only during low water periods. If you were to look at the date that this article was from, or this newspaper article or whatever, but it was only if you compared it with the lake levels. It was always the time periods when there were low water levels. You just didn't see anything written that's dated during the high water level.
Hmm.
And there's sometimes 30 years between these cycles of low and high water levels. People used to think that, oh, it's about maybe 5 years, 7 years the seeds would stay viable. But they have to stay viable longer than that if you think about those 30-year cycles of the Great Lakes.
Hmm.
There was also an Audubon preserve here that had a water control structure on a marsh, and the water level had been high for 15 years. They decided to drop the water level, and literally the year they dropped the water level, the marsh was covered in wild
There
rice.
it was, huh?
So those seeds were viable 15 years down
So
in
that
that
means
seed
if the
bank.
Army Corps of Engineers came in and dredged it, then they would have removed most of that seed bank, probably in the
Yep, they
dredging.
probably did. Yeah, they probably did. And then, of course, water pollution came after that, after we had industrialization take
Hmm.
place, and it took a lot of hits. But
Yeah.
um, one of the biggest hits we had here in Michigan, we're the Great Lakes state. We've got Great Lakes everywhere, but we also have lots of wetlands, lakes, inland streams. And we had a malaria epidemic in the mid 1800s. They didn't know where malaria came from, so they just knew that people got sick when they were around swamplands. So their
Yeah.
mission was to drain all the swamplands for
Oh
public
no, yeah,
health.
okay. Yeah.
And so there was a lot of that took place. They actually had a goal to drain the entire state, which it blows my mind when I think about that today, to drain off all the wetlands in the state.
Yeah.
But when you drive around here, especially in the Lower Peninsula, the southern half of the Lower Peninsula, you can see these big drainage ditches that are from that time period still there, draining what used to be marshlands. Also, they did a lot of dredging and draining to create agricultural fields.
Mhm.
Muck farming was a biggie. There
What's muck
was
farming?
muck farming. What started over in, I think, Denmark and the Netherlands, over in that part of the world. And the folks over there found out somehow or another, if you drain a lake, you can grow onions and root crops, basically celery, things like that, in the mucky soils that are left
Mhm.
behind. So there was an elder here named Frank Edowagijik who called me one day and he said, "Hey Barb, do you ever hear about this little lake over by Grand Rapids, Michigan, called Rice Lake?" He said, "My people have stories of harvesting rice there, but it's an onion farm now." And I'm like, no, but I'll check it out. So I started investigating, and sure enough, it was probably the largest inland rice bed that we had here.
Mm-mm.
Rice Lake was 3.5 miles long, and it was surrounded by wetlands and covered with wild rice. And I talk about the story in depth in my book, but basically, these farmers got together and decided they heard about this new thing called muck farming, and they dug a trench 20 feet wide, 5 miles long, and drained the entire lake.
Wow.
It's completely gone,
Wow.
completely gone. And the sad thing was that was um, that was an important food source for the tribal people. They
Mhm.
lived off of that rice. And here these non-tribal people come in without a thought, and they have that ownership mentality, right? This is our lake. We're gonna, even though this was a major food source for these tribal folks, and they just destroyed it
It's
without a
strange
thought.
again, like to think about I see this with bison. I think about the story of the bison in the plains and what happened there, and the idea of clearing the bison off the land so you could raise cows.
Yeah,
Because you can
yeah,
own the cows and you can't own the bison. So it's
right.
like, but the idea of destroying an incredibly rich, evolved to the place, adapted food
Mm,
source, and then replacing it with a non-native food source that requires so much more input and work, and it just doesn't make any sense. Like the value of rice to me versus the value of onions, I really like onions, but the
yeah,
value of rice to me is so much higher than the value of onions when I think about sitting down to a meal. It's a
yeah.
tragedy.
It is. It is. But that muck farming, there was another huge marsh here by Lansing where I live, 4,000 acre marsh called the Chandler Marsh, and it was actually drained off as well. And I often wanted to write a book about lost lakes of Michigan to
Oh
try to
wow.
see. There must have been other ones that were drained off, but it's really hard to find that information. I don't know if I'll ever succeed in it,
Right.
but it's sad. It's sad to think about a whole lake and a whole ecosystem there, um, full of ducks and bulrushes and cattails and wild
Right.
rice and fish, uh, gone. And you can actually go there today. There's a dirt road that runs right smack through the middle of that old lake bed. You can stand in the middle of it, and If you look at a map, you can see old maps. You can see where the forest was around the outer perimeter of the marsh.
Hmm.
You can totally see that on the landscape to this day. That forest is still there.
Um, when I think about the Endangered Species Act, which you were talking about doing some work with in the past, it represents to me kind of a shifting in the consciousness of um, the United States. And it's like a
Mm-hmm.
awareness of ecology had finally filtered in. And
Mm-hmm.
so obviously I'm not trying to say that it's perfect or, we've got it all figured out here now, but it's like a shift in awareness. And it's just so hard to like imagine the mindset before for a person today. Like it's just, we know better than a lot of that. But anyway, the idea now of getting rid of so many species to just grow something like an onion is,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? We've really like learned a lot, but like the amount of damage that was done is just almost incalculable. The
Yeah.
idea of clearing all of that, those amphibians and all of those fish and all of that waterfowl and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
carbohydrate rich rice, today just seems like, well, somebody, somebody would stand up about that today and probably be heard. But wow.
Yeah.
Where are we at today with rice, and what happened, and where are things at now? We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, new episodes of the WildFed TV show are airing each Monday on the Outdoor Channel at 7 p.m. I think WildFed is bringing something really fresh to TV, a show that honors the species we're hunting, fishing, or foraging, and recognizes and validates human beings as a species and celebrates our participation in the ecosystem. Check us out on Monday at 7 p.m. East and 11 p.m. East on the Outdoor Channel. Season 1 of the WildFed TV show is 10 episodes, and this week Outdoor Channel is airing episode 7. It features a solo day of brook trout fishing in the mountains of Maine and an afternoon of milkweed flower harvesting with my wife, Ivani. We bring those ingredients back home and cook them over a campfire. It's one of my favorite episodes of the season, and I think one of the most beautifully shot as well. If you're like me and you don't have cable, you can use the Friendly app. That's Friendly TV. They spell it FRNDLY TV.com. It's Friendly without any vowels. It's less than $7 a month, and it gives you access to Outdoor Channel shows as they air, as well as some other networks too. And for our Canadian friends and family, you can see us on the Sportsman's Channel Canada, Tuesdays at 8 p.m. East. Also, I'll be hosting some social media live streams for Outdoor Channel after the episodes air, so be sure to follow WildFed on social media or subscribe to our twice-a-month newsletter, The Subsistence, to be notified about those. Now, back to the show.
Well, we have one really large rice bed. It's not the only rice bed left. A lot of times people misunderstand me when I talk about this. It's the last large rice bed that we have, and that's Tawas Lake. And the rice bed on that lake, when I looked at it in GIS, was somewheres around 700 acres, um, which is big, but
But nothing like
compared
what
to,
you were describing before, right?
yeah, nothing like what we had before. Um, that is our biggest, and we've got a few other ones that are maybe 100 acres, um, maybe two or three of those, and all the rest are just small patches here and there. We had when my goal was in the beginning when I first learned about Manoomin was, first of all, is it rare? How many rice beds are there? If I don't know about this, I'm a little concerned there might be a problem here. And my goal was to map every rice bed that I could find historically and present day. And
Wow.
so what I ended up finding for locations that were very precise that I could put on a map, I found about 212 or so. And those were all historic records. And then for ones that are in existence today, like stamp records, I found about 140. Of that 140, only 14 of those were historical as well.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
So those 200, um, are that we had before are likely gone. There's never been a systemic survey, so and this is, these numbers change all the time depending on if people are out and they find rice growing somewhere. They're always adding to the map, but we have a two species here, a lake rice and a river rice, and the river rice is considered a state threatened species.
Would
It
that
only
be
grows,
Zizania aquatica?
yeah,
Okay.
Zizania aquatica.
Okay.
That grows in the rivers in the southern part of the state. And then palestris, the lake rice, grows in the rest of the state.
And you said that it's endangered there. Is it actually listed?
It's listed threatened species, one step
Okay.
below
So
endangered by
got
the
it.
state
Okay.
of
So there's
Michigan.
not really anything. Are there anything like any regulations that come into play at that um, designation or no?
Yeah, that particular species you can't harvest unless the tribal folks have worked out. They have treaty rights and things like that, so they've worked out harvesting with the DNR. But other than that, there's no harvesting of that species.
Okay.
It's only the lake rice, and we don't have any harvesting regulations in Michigan at all yet. That's
That was my
something that
next question, actually,
we're
because
working
I'm
on.
wondering. Just I don't know a lot about Minnesota's laws, but I know Minnesota does have a worked out a system there, and so I was
Mhm.
curious if that system is, in your mind, a good model, or do you see it as something that needs to be improved as well? Like, in if you know much about it, if you want to share anything for the listener who might not be aware.
Yeah, I think they have a good model. I know they worked with the tribes on developing it, and I think it's Wisconsin that doesn't allow out of state racers.
Okay.
Um, in Minnesota, I think you can get a permit for 1 day if you're an out of state ricer, and then they have designated rice lakes. The tribal people have rice chiefs that open and close the lakes, um, and here we don't have, like I said, that many rice beds. I mean, so we don't have that many people who go ricing either. As you know, it's a lot of work. Getting the rice is not half the work. It's the processing of the rice afterward
Man,
that
that's
takes.
where I always end up bottlenecking is I've got
Yeah.
a lot of rice dried and bagged up, but that
Mhm.
parching and winnowing in my household is our bottleneck. So we end up sometimes like we're actually stuck in that place right now where we've got a big bowl upstairs that we're sort of hand picking through and
Mhm.
just will like get enough for a meal. And then it's like, okay, got to pick through this again because we've got just that final step after winnowing where you got all the little bits that you still got to get out. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
getting it actually completed is really, it's just challenging to keep up with in the modern,
Yeah.
kind of with a modern lifestyle.
It is, and it's a family activity or community activity, as
Right.
many of the wild food processing activities are. And I run solo in the world, so for me, it's really hard to process rice. And I ended up getting a machine built that does the dancing and the winnowing part for me.
Oh, I wanna
And
talk to you about that. Let's
yeah,
finish your thought, but I really wanna talk about that with you.
yeah, and so, that's helpful, and then I have, the women's circle, which we'll be talking about, the Gathering Society. They will come, and we have tribal women in there too, and so we'll do, like, traditional rice camp day where we do the dancing in the traditional way with moccasins and,
Mhm.
all that. The hand parching is still the same, and then I'll have people will contact me about processing their rice for them, which I have mixed feelings about, to be honest with you. Um, I've had people call me and say, "Oh, my husband went out and harvested 300 pounds of rice, and we don't know what to do with it." And and
Yeah.
and there's so much wrong with that,
Mhm.
like that's a sacred plant. First of all, you've taken 300 pounds of individual lives. Each one of those seeds is a rice plant that you've removed with no idea what to do with it. To me, that's a question of respect. And it's greed. I really try to get people to think about planning. How much do you really need to get you
Hmm.
through a year. And when you come down to it, 150 pounds of rice off the
Yeah.
water or 200 pounds of rice off the water will give someone with a family of four that eats it a few times a week plenty,
Yeah.
and plenty to share. But we, non-tribal world, we come from this mentality of more is better, and um, it's like people that go out and find a patch of morels and pick every one of them.
Oh man, here it's our fiddleheads and it's our wild
Hmm.
weeks. And yeah, if somebody showed up at my door and said, "Hey, Daniel, I shot 4 deer. I don't know what to do." It's
Yeah.
also like, it's irresponsible, but it's
Yes.
also like a lot to put on somebody else too. You know, it's
Well, it is.
like you said, like you need a plan. I noticed that a lot of hunters that I've encountered, they they've only thought through up to the shot they're going to take, and then after there's no plan, and so
Yes.
much is lost.
Yeah. Exactly. And I'm sure you probably feel the same way, but um, I always try to talk to people about not thinking about wild foods as a commodity.
Hmm.
Um, to me, they are gifts for us as individual animals, as individual people, as a family or a small group of people, to feed us. They're not monocultures. They're not a field of corn or a field of wheat or whatever. They're a limited supply. They're Our part in that is no different than the deer browsing, or the butterfly sipping nectar or whatever. Um, it's it's for us to sustain us, not to hoard and take as much as we possibly can and to wipe it out, which is our tendency. And so I'm always trying to get people to think about that when they are going out into the woods. Like, slow down, be in the moment, know that this is a gift. This is not a resource. I try to get people to change their language. This is a gift, and
How do you
look at it that
reconcile
way.
that though with like you have a scientific training and background, and
Mhm,
you worked for the department, it sounds like, and you understand the conservation models that are in place currently.
mhm,
And also, I'm sure you've run into it. It's like you can say to a person something like if you said to me, if you took me foraging, like no one else is listening, it's just me and you in the woods,
mhm.
and you introduced me to a species I don't know, and you say, Daniel, just listen to your heart. Like I'll
Mhm.
know how to do that,
Right.
but not everybody knows how to do that. You know what I mean?
That's right.
And
That's right.
and then this there's two things that I see. That one is the just greed, where it's like as soon as you tell somebody something has value, even if they don't know how to use it. I've watched hoarders, for instance, who will just accumulate, like they'll get it in their head that a certain type of ceramic plate is valuable. So you go
Mhm.
down in their basement and they got 700 they found at all the pawn shops. They don't have any plan for what to do with them. They just accumulate what they imagine. It's like the dragon with the gold thing. And then
Yeah.
there's also the tragedy of the commons, where it's like, oh, I only took two, but you're like one of 10,000 people that took two, and now there's none because we all just took a little. We all just took a little. We all just took a little. So it's like those
Right.
two different attitudes. One is just straight greed, and one is thinking, well, hey, I just took my part.
Mhm.
But how do you reconcile that with, because, for those of us who don't, and I guess this is part of a much bigger question too, Barb, because it's like you've been talking a lot about sort of the indigenous folks on this continent, and there's you couldn't have more diametrically opposite worldviews of the Europeans who came and the indigenous that lived here, and they saw the world so differently. And
Mhm.
here we are all now. Like I said, there's been a lot of changes that have happened in the collective mindset. But how do we reconcile these two things? Because you it really becomes obvious when we start talking about something like people of European descent foraging, because we approach things with such a different way of looking at it.
Yeah. I really think language is a big part of it. I interviewed for a job with our DNR one time for a wildlife biologist position, and I've been around the block, so I knew one of the guys that was interviewing, and um, we were sort of just philosophizing about nature and people's relationship with it. And of course, these are guys that are Western science educated, like I was, and kept calling, timber stands and harvestable fur bearers and that kind of stuff. And I said, well, let's try a little something here. And I said, instead of calling that forest a timber stand, I want you to change your words and call it your relatives. And I got them to try to use different words when they were talking about it, and it messed them up. The guy that was the forester, he was like, "Man, this is effing with my mind." And I said, "Yeah, that's supposed to.
Yeah,
Once
good.
once you change how you speak about something, and if you call the trees your relatives, it's no longer something that like it instills a respect right off the bat, right? If you
Hmm.
call it a resource or a timber stand, then you're looking at it from a human centric point of view, and that's something for me to take, that's mine to use. If you view it as your relative or as an equal being on this planet with the right to exist and be healthy and whole, it changes your relationship with it. And I think that that's part of the problem that we non-tribal people have is, and it may come from religious backgrounds. I don't know for sure, uh, but we tend to look at everything as ours for the use, ours for the taking,
Hmm.
rather than that we are a part of this relationship. And just seeing these people use these different words and how it affected their thinking really reinforced to me that that's a strong teaching. I had a student that I wanted her to write about water for a website, and I said, "What I want you to do is to write about why water quality is important." So she wrote this really nice scientific paper, and I said, "No, you missed it." So I
Hmm.
said, "I want you to go look up the water walkers, the women who walk for the water in the Anishinaabe culture.
Hmm.
And I want you to read their teachings about water, and then I want you to try again." So she wrote again. She got a little closer, but she was still in the Western mindset. The third try, I said, "I want you to replace the word water with the name of a female relative who you love with all of your heart." And as soon as she did that, what she wrote was beautiful and
Hmm.
was completely different. It reflected a relationship, one of nurturing and love and respect. That Western science piece kind of melted away. And she said, "Oh, I get it now. I get it now." So, and I learned a lot of that, from I studied the language with some of my Anishinaabeg friends, and I have one dear friend who's a teacher of the language. And I learned that that was kind of intuitive to me. I've always felt that way about the natural world. But the language piece of it, once I started really learning about the Anishinaabeg language, um, that was something that really stood out to me, is how we speak about other beings really defines our relationship with them.
And just for clarity too, that seems to be, from what I understand, that seems to be true of most of the indigenous languages here on this
Mhm.
continent. And
Mhm.
part of, like you said, I mean, your synaptic network is built so much by language. So
Mhm.
it's very difficult when you have all of this neural net that's built around seeing things as resources. It's not
Mhm.
like a super simple shift. I think, like you said, some of us have always kind of understood this intuitively, but not
Mhm.
everybody. And the other thing that occurs to me though is that what you've said is not at odds with the science either. So it's
Right.
like, if you look at the phylogenetic tree of life, the tree is your relative from that Western scientific perspective, and
Mhm.
it's also alive, and therefore, as a living being, to say a non-human person, for instance, it's clearly a living thing with its own life history and natural history and agenda for itself that's irrespective of our needs of
Mhm.
it. So it's not really at odds with the science. It's like at odds with the tradition. And as
Mhm.
you said, a lot of that might be rooted in a sort of more dominionistic origin story. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but like
And
so what happens? Like, where do you see this? We're kind of straying off of the wild rice path here, but I'm curious, like how are these things to be reconciled? Because we're all living here now, and
mhm.
it's like I come from, the mountains of Sicily, but I was born on this continent. Here I am and
Mhm.
living my life
Mhm.
here, like how do we reconcile all this and how do you see this playing out in the future?
Well, I think really getting I'm a firm believer that we need to teach ecology starting kindergarten every year
Hmm.
until people are done with their education, because we don't the majority of people don't live with the earth anymore. They don't live in the country, they live in the cities. They're very much detached from nature, and what they do get in the city is just, it's very different than out when you're out in nature. And I think people, because we don't spend every day out in it anymore and haven't for generations, we've lost the understanding of our part in it and how everything is connected. And so we don't think about the impacts of our actions on the planet like we would if we understood what they were. And to have that ecological perspective, um, and that training of your vision starting as a young child, I think would help a lot in terms of how we relate to the earth and understand how much a part of it we are rather than separate. Because as you know, everything that we do impacts everything else, just like everything that other things do impact us. And that lost connection, I think if we can find a way to reconnect people, and it's hard with this age of technology.
Hmm.
You know, I spent the last 2 days watching news,
Yeah.
seeing what's going on in Washington, D.C. I wasn't out in the woods. And with our cell phones and everything, people are just absolutely enamored and in love and addicted to this technology, which takes us even further away from nature and understanding. I mean, if you think about it, at one time, all of us knew most all the plants, we knew most all the trees. We knew how to
Bioregionally.
Yes, we knew how to we knew the animals we lived with. People could read the weather. Some of the tribal people tell me that they can change the weather.
Hmm.
Our knowledge base was so vast compared to what we know today because we lived in it, and it was part of our life every day.
Two
Um,
things emerge for me as you're saying this, and I'll just say them and kind of leave it to you to comment on it. But one is this bioregionality piece, which is like, and I know some studies have been done on this recently, but you don't need the study for this because it's intuitive. It's like if you ask an average kid in New York, hey, like a kindergarten kid, first
mhm,
grader, to tell you about some different animals, they typically tell you about um, megafauna from Africa,
right.
you know,
Yeah.
which,
Yeah.
but they typically don't really know much about the animals that live in the landscape where they are. And
Mhm,
then also, I think in that same work, they found that when they did know animals in their local environment, they tended to have a negative view of them as
mhm.
either dangerous or dirty. Oh, raccoons, oh yeah, stay away from them. They're diseased and
Yeah.
dirty. And but lions and zebras are really cool. So that's like one really strange piece. And then the other thing is that it's interesting how if I was standing outside, my backyard slopes off to a brook that runs down to a beaver bog, and I wouldn't stand out there with like a bottle of shampoo or dish soap and just pour it into the water. And I wouldn't,
Mhm,
spray WD-40 down into there or, like I would know better. I wouldn't throw my trash in there. We do it in our house, like down the drain feels like it goes away, into the
mhm.
trash feels like it goes away.
Yeah.
And we all obviously know intellectually that it does not. But
Right.
when we're in our house, like you were just describing, it's like it's like we're astronauts or something on a space station. We just forget
Yes.
that this stuff is actually impacting the landscape. It's amazing.
Yes, we're insulated.
Mm-hmm.
One time, my grandpa, he always called me a tree hugger. Said, "You're always going to smell the roses, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, always will." Whenever he would change his oil, he would go out in his backyard, which was in a very low-lying area, about 20 feet from the edge of a pond in the woods, and he would dump his oil right into the ground. And I would scold him about this, "Grandpa, that's really, really bad thing to do." And toward the end of his life, he said, "You were right." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "That oil." So the other day I went out and poured that oil down on the ground and it came up 10 feet away from me. It came right back up.
Wow.
He was an engineer too, a professor
Yeah.
of engineering. Like,
Right.
but it's that disconnect of what our actions do. How do they impact the other beings that are
Mm-hmm.
living with us?
I have a friend here, Arthur Haynes, who, as a botanist and a naturalist and a forager and a hunter and practitioner of some primitive skills and whatnot, when his daughter was born, she quickly learned, at a very, very young age, many of the bird species that live here and their calls.
Hmm.
And he would tell me that sometimes, people would come up and they'd say to her, "Samara, what's the bird say?" Thinking she's going to be like, "Tweet, tweet." And she'd be
Hmm.
like, "Which bird?" Like she'd look at them like, what kind of stupid question is that? Like, what bird are we talking about? Like they all
I
make the
love
same
that.
noise.
I love
And
that.
I think it's that, and they pointed out to me how hard it was to find bioregional, like let's say stuffed animals or animal
Hmm.
toys. So it's
Yeah.
like very easy to find the lion and the tiger, but to try to
Yeah.
find a brook trout or or a
Yeah.
fisher or something, it's like
Yeah.
you just don't find that. So it's strange how it's like globalism in
Hmm.
our, I understand why people think, it's like a John Lennon Imagine song, like globalism is so good, but it's like, wow, without that bioregionality,
Hmm.
and I see it a lot too in activism where it's like people will go, 2,000 miles to get their voices in on an issue, but then not be aware of the issues that are taking place under their feet.
Right.
And so it's not a criticism, but it's an observation that sometimes we we're more concerned about other places than the places where we are. And I don't see how
Yes.
we can really kind of like turn the ship around if we
Hmm.
aren't aware of what's happening where we are. And that kind of brings me back to foraging, because foraging makes you aware of the place where you are. And you were talking earlier, you used the word relationships. It's like, if you don't have a relationship to place, then you have no incentive to care about any particular place. And this
Hmm.
theme that's come up on the show so much is this: I grow quite tired of this conversation about the environment, because I'll often,
Hmm.
it's sort of like, what's the bird say? It's like, what's the environment? Like, take me to a place
Yes.
and let's talk about that place. But the environment seems to be this catch-all term that's everywhere and nowhere at once. And
Hmm.
so how do you protect that? That doesn't make any sense. But it
Right.
does make sense to say, I'm going to protect, you know, Rice Lake or,
Yes. Yeah.
my foraging spot or whatever.
Well, a good illustration of place kind of is um, the relationship people develop with the birds they feed in their backyard. They're wild birds. They get to know them. They sometimes get to know them on an individual basis.
Mm,
Sometimes they'll feed them right out of their hand, and they become very protective of those birds to the
yeah.
point where they'll shoot blue jays or squirrels or hawks. So anybody that's going to threaten their birds, right?
Right.
That they become so protective of these birds. And the birds are wild, and if they could develop that sense of devotion to the bigger picture, to the bigger picture of nature, that would be great. That would be
Hmm.
great. You know, it would be. Um, but it's getting people to open their eyes and spend that time.
And accept the humility that you need to have, though, too, right? Because in order to see the world in that bigger way, if you've been really dominionistic about your approach, then it's like, wow, I really have to take a step down. Like maybe
Hmm.
I'm not the center,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
I think one of the interesting things too, when you do a little bit of an analysis of the difference between the tribal mindset and the Western mindset, is that the Western mindset elevates the ego so much, whereas the tribal mindset elevates the community so much.
Hmm.
And, you get this, we're seeing now, I guess we're sort of looking out and we're coming to terms with the results of 7 billion egos acting like the world is theirs.
Yeah.
And then you get that very large scale tragedy of the commons, where we have no prairie left, you know,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And we, not only is it gone, but it turned to a dust bowl, and then we poured chemicals on it to get it to sort of grow stuff again. It's like, oh man, it's a
Exactly.
pretty bad scenario. And but it comes from all of these egos running amok, and
Yeah.
I guess it brings me back to that thing. It's like, and ultimately, because I wonder, like, how do we reconcile it? And then I go like, okay, well, like, Daniel, you can't reconcile it. Get out. What do don't play God here. What can you do? So I chop wood, carry water. It's like, that's all I can do, is just do.
Yep.
I'll have a relationship, and I'll encourage other people to have a relationship, because ultimately I don't know what else I can really do. And it feels so meaningful to me. But that actually makes me want to ask you about the Gathering Society, because I want to hear about sort of how practically, you're sharing these kind of things with
Sure.
other people.
Sure. The Gathering Society is this really amazing, amazing circle of women that I started about 10 years ago. My goal at that time was to try to create a community of women who were interested in, who are living these things, right? Who were foragers or medicine people or whatever. I didn't want to be in a teaching role all the time. I wanted to learn as well. And so I started this group, and we basically had two goals, or two things in our mission. One is to keep traditional knowledge alive, regardless of what culture that you're coming from, and to build bridges between tribal and non tribal communities. And we do the latter part through the relationships that we have with each other. So we get together once a month when it's not COVID time here in Lansing at my house, or we'll meet at other members' homes wherever they live. And either someone teaches a traditional skill. A lot of our Native sisters, they've taught things like beading and wild medicines, things like that, songs, traditional songs. We do work days where we'll process wild rice. We have a annual apple cider making day. We do hominy making, corn scorching, mushroom hunting, cheese making. All these kind of food traditions are old traditions. The beautiful thing is that a lot of our women have worked in government, tribal governments, or state or federal governments. When they have to deal with issues that, particularly the non tribal women, if they have to deal with issues that are important to tribal people, they've learned why it's important. They've learned about that issue through our circle. And that's a really amazing thing. We've had over 400 women come through since we
Wow.
started,
How long ago
which has
did you
been
say it started?
about 10 years ago.
Wow. 400 women.
Yeah, and I'm very insistent on us being an active group, right? It's because it's a community, it's a sisterhood, it's a living thing. It's not like a club or an organization. We can only carry traditions forward if we practice them and we
Hmm.
master them and we learn them and we share them. We can only build relationships if we come together. So I've been very insistent about that. And so we will, every year I go through the email list And I say, oh, these people's names, I have never met them other than when they initially contacted me. So I'd invite them if they want to pledge that they're going to be active, they can stay. Otherwise, say come back when it fits your life more, so
I
that we
really
have
like that.
active people.
So you
Yeah,
purge the list.
we clean up the list.
Hmm.
Otherwise, we couldn't survive, and the teachings can't survive. And that's what this is all about. We're just carriers of tradition, and that's a big responsibility. Um, and so, for us to keep those traditions going, we have to make that commitment. And so it's been really fantastic. We have a circle in North Carolina now, besides the one in Michigan. We have one that is going to be forming in California. One in Kansas is going to be forming. We have members from lots of different tribes and different states. My hope is someday that there's gathering society circles everywhere,
Mm.
and that women are sharing these traditions, and particularly bringing in the younger girls so that they can learn when they're young, like I was. I would have given anything to have a gathering society,
Yeah.
a group of
Yeah.
mentors when I was a kid. But if women are interested, and we keep it a women's circle because a couple of reasons. One, in the traditional Anishinaabe teachings, they have women's teachings and men's teachings, and so we try to respect that with the tribal women's culture. But also, we're trying to empower women, and a lot of times when I hate to say this, but when guys come into the circle or to activities, the women tend to give up their power sometimes, and so we're trying to empower women, uh, get them to be strong and learn these teachings, and then take them home to their families and others. And
I'm really glad that you just said that part because I've been, I struggle with sort of this um, suppression of sexual dimorphism that's taking
mhm,
place because
mhm,
um, I feel like I understand the mindset, but how do I say this? It's such a delicate topic to tread.
sure,
Sometimes I feel like people don't fully even understand human history and what it was like in the past,
hmm,
and how there's never been a moment in history where it was even possible to just say, "Oh, we're all just going to do the same stuff." It was never possible before. So it's like
right,
a really new idea. And whenever there's a new idea, it seems like for whatever reason, it's like everyone must adopt it now. And it's like, whoa, whoa,
right,
whoa. like
right,
let's slow down here and even like let's test the idea because
hmm,
maybe we don't determine that it works that well. But the idea that we even have to tread lightly on the idea of a women's society is so strange to me. I
yeah,
know as a man that when I'm in a men's group, you introduce a woman into that group and the dynamic so radically and quickly shifts.
yeah,
Like
it,
men have a way they are when there are women present and a way they are when women aren't present.
hmm,
And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it in just like it just changes the dynamic. And if men are doing um, men's work, and I don't mean by that like, labor, but I mean like dealing with men's issues. It's
hmm,
really difficult to do that because the polarity suddenly shifts. It's like all of the electrons flow from, the anode to the cathode or
right,
whatever.
right.
And we're specifically gathering for that not to happen. So it seems so valuable to me, but has anybody challenged you on that or is everybody pretty much understood?
No, we have. Well, I shouldn't say that. We've had a few members who have an issue with that. They want to bring their boyfriends or they want to bring their male sons or whatever, and I try to explain to them this is why this is a women's circle, and if it doesn't work for you, maybe there's other circles that you could join that do. I've tried over the years to have family gatherings, like our apple cider day. Anybody's welcome to come in their family, but it tends to be that they don't come. It's still just the women who show up, and
Right, right.
I don't personally. I think it's important for women to have that space. I think it's
Hmm.
important for men to have their space. I think the problems come in when it's exclusionary because you're trying to keep other people down. That's where
Correct. Yeah.
I think you get into that trouble. But um, it's so far it's been good, and we have a website that it's www.thegatheringsociety.com, and people can go and check us out. And if women are interested in joining or want more information, they can email me there, and we can, explore that. I am just the group of women that are part of our circle are amazing. We've got our youngest member is like 8 years old. Our oldest member is 83,
Wow.
and it's just a fantastic community. And with COVID, it's been great. We've been very supportive of one another, and sharing with ideas about how to do some of these skills that have helped carry us through when there's a shortage of this or a shortage of that, or if people are losing family members or sick with the illness, that we can help financially, or through prayers, or any food, or whatever kind of support we can offer. So it's kind of our way of having like a small local village, even though we're not all living in the same place. We still have that connection.
As somebody who's got the dual perspectives, trained in science, but also trained in some of these teachings that you've been talking about, and as somebody, as an ecologist who can look out at the planet and see the state that it's in, and then as somebody who understands historically what it was like in the past, what's your level of optimism and or pessimism as you look out at the future beyond, let's say, 10 years, 20 years, but looking out in a bigger picture way? Because it seems like you have a contingent who would like to restore the earth and the human relationship to it. And then
Mm-hmm.
you have a contingent that would use every last living thing here as fuel to send rocket ships into space,
Right.
and
Right.
those two worldviews are competing. And then there's so many people sort of caught in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, where do you see that headed? And do you think that there's the potential that, do you believe realistically there's a potential that this Western way of thinking can be merged with a more indigenous way of thinking, such that the two, because I think both of those sides have, I mean, there's a there's a lot that can be shed and a lot that can be gained, mutually.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, do you see it as something that will realistically happen on Earth?
Nah, no, I don't. I think I'm probably a pretty big pessimist in terms of what I think that humans in general, as a whole global group, I'm pretty pessimistic, and that's because everything is driven by money.
Hmm.
And you were talking about the Endangered Species Act. It was created to protect endangered species, and a lot of our environmental laws that were created back in the 70s had really good intentions. But like the Clean Water Act, the goal of that is zero pollutants, right?
Hmm.
Well, the resource agencies issue permits all the time for people to dump pollutants into the water.
Hmm.
There's no thought about zero pollutants. We have to protect business, right? And in the Endangered Species Act, there's a clause in there that says, unless it will cause economic harm.
Hmm.
So, as long as money is what drives our world, I don't have much hope for people. Um, and that's sad to say. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to go down fighting. I will.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not. I don't give up.
Right.
But do I feel like I'm going to win this battle? No, I don't. But I love the earth. I love people. I love all my relatives, and there's no choice for me. I have to devote my life completely to trying to heal those wounds and try to bring people together and try to bring people back to the earth. Maybe the younger generations can turn things around, but until we get our population reduced and our energy consumption reduced, I have a very pessimistic view of the future for us.
How far
And
out do you have to go for
that's just
that?
being honest.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm asking. Looking out, is your pessimism like, are you pessimistic like, geez, 10, 20 years from now? Are you pessimistic 500 years from now? Like, you know, when do we see these crises really hit? Because,
Well,
or are we right in it, you know?
we're seeing them now. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
as an endangered species biologist, there's species that I used to survey for. For instance, bats. I used to do a lot of caving back in the 90s in Pennsylvania, looking for bats and other things. And those caves were full of bats. There are no bats in those caves anymore.
Hmm.
They're they were impacted by the white nose syndrome, and
Hmm.
a
That's a
lot of the
fungal
species,
infection.
yeah, a lot of those species are listed now. The monarch, which was totally common when I started my career, is now should be listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as a threatened or endangered species. It's going to be listed as a candidate species because they have other species ahead of that one, right? There's species of things I've studied in my career that have completely disappeared from Michigan. And so I've seen this with my conservation work. I've seen it. I've seen when I was young, like, I was born in the late 50s. If you look at Al Gore's population chart and the exponential growth that we have experienced, I remember when I was young, there were not this many people. And if you look,
Yeah.
and it's a true it's true.
Yeah,
If
of
you look
course.
at the data, the number of people that were here in the 60s is
Hmm.
way less than the number of people that are here today. And with those people come development. And you can see how we're just, as I researched the book, it was heart wrenching to me to see and read about the beautiful land here in Michigan and the wetlands and the forests. They said a squirrel could jump across the trees all across the state unbroken. And you just see over time in the history as we're just gobbling it up piece by piece by piece by
Hmm.
piece. And it's not stopping. You can still drive anywhere around here and see them building new housing developments, new this, new that.
Everywhere. Everywhere. I
And
see it
then we
everywhere.
won't stop until we've gobbled it all up.
The
The
population in 1960, by the way, 3 billion.
Yeah. And what is it today? 6?
7, I think.
7? Yeah.
7 plus.
Yeah, 7 plus.
So more than a
So,
doubling.
yeah. And when I would go north in Michigan when I was a kid, I didn't have to drive up to the UP to feel like I was up north. But now I have to feel like I'm up in the UP or the very northern lower part of the lower peninsula because people have expanded so much. We don't have the resources and the land to produce the amount of food that we're going to need at that continued exponential growth rate.
Hmm.
So we have to reduce our population and we have to reduce our energy consumption and look at the manufacturing side of this green energy stuff because there's no free
Yeah.
lunch there's no free lunch. That's a whole nother show, right? There's no free
Yeah, it's
lunch about it.
hilarious to me. Like, oh, it's so much better. It's like, it's all the same materials or even weirder
Yes.
materials we'll need to mine. I mean, I always joke
Yes.
with people about their Priuses. I'll go like, look, your car's made out of the exact same stuff as my car. It's just that
Hmm.
I put the fuel in and I see it locally, and your fuel is being generated by damned rivers or burning
Yes.
garbage somewhere or nuclear power. But
Yes.
we got 4 rubber tires each. You got way more battery than me that has to be disposed of. Like, it's not it's maybe a little less worse, but it's not much better, you know?
Yeah, and people like to look at the carbon footprint, right? They're looking at the end game. They're not looking at what's happening in the front. And there's a really great documentary out called Planet of the Humans that a friend of mine, Jeff Gibbs, put out with Michael Moore, and they look in depth at this issue and how we're really fooling ourselves. We're basically like addicts switching from heroin to cocaine and thinking that's okay, and it's
Yeah, methadone.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not. We can't continue to use energy or increase our energy use at the same rate. And the green infrastructure, that's what it's doing. It's not reducing our footprint, even though people want to believe it is. They want to feel like they're doing something good by putting up solar panels. I get that. But you have to think like an ecologist, right?
Mm.
What is the impact? Look at the big picture. How is all of this related? We don't do that. We just look at, oh, I'm doing something good. I'm going to buy an electric car and get a solar panel and put a windmill up, and I'm doing my duty. No.
I got two things that I'd like to bring up here, and these are gonna. One of them's like a challenge to what you're saying, but not because I'm actually challenging it, but because it's something
Sure.
that runs through my mind when I think about these things. So that first piece is, you know, 10,000 years ago, North America was covered in just an outrageous, exotic menagerie of Pleistocene megafauna
Mm-hmm.
that, and there was a tremendous extinction that happened.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many genera lost and so many species lost. And sometimes I wonder, is like, we talk about the Pleistocene extinction, and I wonder, like, well, has it ever really stopped? Because it
Mm-hmm.
seems like that's just a, you know, that's only 10,000 years. You know, when you look at things in a big history way, it's nothing. And it's, so are we just in a large die off event? I mean, obviously we're contributing tremendously to it, which I'm not in any way trying to deny,
Sure.
but all of those dinosaurs gone, and
Mm-hmm.
some new order emerges. So are we watching a die off event, not realizing that something new will be born? So that's one thought. And then
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is, when I look around, it seems to me that we are seeing all of the signs of empire collapse. So,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, I mean, you go all the way back, and it's like every single civilization collapses, and it's at the height of its hubris, right at its collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And we seem to be there. And when COVID first hit, it was like you saw that ripple go through, revealing all of the weaknesses in the infrastructure and in the globalization. And it was like
Mm-hmm.
just a shudder, you know, like a little premonition of like, wow, how quick it could shut down and break down.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, a lot of what we're talking about is sort of based on the idea that we continue to do this until nothing's left. But do you see an empire collapse happening? And also just your thoughts on, you know, how ecosystems have been through cataclysmic events, in many ways much worse than what we're doing, different,
Mm-hmm.
but,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in some ways much more shocking in the sense of, you know, asteroid impacts and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, I think we're in the middle of an ecological collapse. The difference between the dinosaur time and now is they had plenty of wild left to repopulate and new
Yeah, that's a
species
good
to
point.
come up.
Hmm.
We don't have that now, and it's to such a degree that I heard a speaker at a conference a couple of years back talking about the forests here in Michigan and the wildflowers and the bird species. And he said that we are at a point right now that we cannot lose one more acre, not one more acre, that we're at the tipping point of losing just common species of wildflowers because of habitat destruction and fragmentation. You look at the polar bears. You look at the decline of the common species that I mentioned before. You look at this habitat fragmentation that's going on. Um, every time there's a new development happening somewhere out in the rural part of your county or whatever animals that lived there, they're being pushed out and displaced, and they have to go find a new place to live if they survive the destruction. There's not anywhere else for them to go. And if they do find habitat, it's already occupied by somebody else. You
Hmm.
know, there's just this tremendous amount of habitat loss and fragmentation that's happened. We have these little natural areas and parks that we keep and deluding ourselves into thinking that this is going to save something. It doesn't. It's to make humans feel like we've done something from an ecological perspective. They're little
Yeah.
islands. You've got to have connectivity between all of these things in order to have biodiversity. And I'm afraid that right now we are experiencing that collapse. You know, they've said, I don't even remember what the latest, they're saying now we're losing one species every hour to extinction,
How can that be? It's crazy, huh?
and we're
Wow.
losing insects. I forgot
Hmm.
what the percentage is that we've lost, the decline in the bird species.
You can see it yourself in if you do a long drive in Maine now. It's like you can
Hmm.
see it yourself on the grill of your car.
Right.
Because when I was a kid, the front of your car would just be almost like a paint job of exoskeletons,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yep.
now it's not like that anymore. There's just so many less in the air.
Yeah. And, you know, that's all food for somebody.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So I am pessimistic, because everything is driven by money, and money doesn't care about dragonflies. They don't care
Hmm.
about fish. It's about short-term profit for the life in the life of a person, which is such a blip in time. But all that to say is that we can't give up. We can't give up. We have to keep trying, and I hope I'm proven wrong.
Right. Yeah. So how then shall we live? Like, what's
By
your
example,
prescription? Because it sure is bitter medicine, right? It's like
is
you know it's true when you hear it, but it's just it's bitter medicine. It's hard to swallow it. It's like I'm the type of person who is always trying to cultivate motivation inside myself, and
yes,
optimism is the way that I'm most effective at that. Uh, and trying to make lemonade out of all the lemons, but
exactly.
I mean, but at the same time, not, I don't want to, I'm not in denial of this either. So it's like trying to find that right balance. What's that look like for you?
For me, it's living, teaching by example, I guess. Trying to walk my talk, and to show people that, I'm not perfect. Obviously, I grew up in this society. I grew up in a capitalist world. I have way too much stuff. I have way too much electronics for my filmmaking and my music and all of that. I'm guilty as the next person. But I try very hard to live my life, and lead by example, and hope, and I know that I inspire people, to learn something new, to try to make something on their own. And I think if everybody tried to inspire others, to do better, that gives me hope. That does give me hope. Um, but it's got to be all of us together working,
At once.
yeah, at working at once. And maybe there's some cataclysmic thing that knocks our population back, but maybe those traditions that we teach on the first Saturday of the month, those carry on in 150 years or whenever this thing happens. Um, Somebody knows how to do something that we taught on our first Saturday of the month, and it's
Yeah.
connected them to the earth, and it's caused them to do something different. You just never know.
Wow. Yeah.
But you can't give up. You can't give up, even if, I mean, I was an athlete when I was a kid, and if we played a team that I knew was going to kick our butts, that didn't mean I did go out and play my best.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, so
Yeah. Wow.
spreading love, holding each other up, lifting each other up, to be the best people that we can be, and helping people achieve their dreams. And I think happiness helps a lot too, helping people to be happy. And I don't know if you've heard of this artist. Her name is Gwen Frostic.
Mm-mm.
She's a Michigan woman. She's passed away quite some time ago, but I love her work. She does block prints of nature, and she wrote poetry and has books with her prints and poetry in it. And she wasn't the kind of environmental activist that would go out and hold a sign and say, quit putting pollution in our waters or things like that. But what she would do would be to open the eyes of people to the beauty around her. And that would inspire people to make change because they could see that beauty. And that's, to me, that is, such a gift. And I think of her a lot, and she really inspired me, inspires me with that way of walking in the world is, you know, and I think that's a lot of what you do with your work. You're showing people the beauty of the world, and that's very inspiring.
It's a practice, really. It's for my wife and I looking at this and saying, like, what's our contribution going to be? And a lot of this I've really learned from her. Her teachings for me have been really transformed my life. But it's like our practice is um, to stay in the heart,
Mm-hmm.
and not in a naive way, but in that sovereign, that powerful, standing on my 2 feet way.
Yes.
And when the negativity comes, it's to just shine brighter light and brighter light and brighter light. Because
Yes.
I find that if I'm not careful, I get drawn by trying to help. I get drawn into something where I realize I'm a resonator of something negative.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
such a fine line, right? Because it's like, I know that's not the spirit that I want to walk in, you
Yes.
know? And so keeping my heart open when what I want to do is be angry. Because all these things we're talking about, there's just a well of anger that's inexhaustible, and a well of
Yes.
grief that's unexhaustible. And I
Yes.
and I don't I I don't I'm not naively cutting myself off from emotions that are real and important at all. I feel all those things, but then my practice is to come back to the heart, because I just don't see another way through this for me personally.
Yes.
I think everybody's got a different role to play, of course, and I'm not trying to project this on anybody else. It's just our practice, but through, prayer and meditation and focus and love, we're going to try to make change with beauty, because I'm more drawn to it. and I,
Sure.
and I feel like it's effective. And so, it's like, I know you make music, and it's like harmonizing things, because right
Exactly.
now there's a tendency to try to use anger, to that thing of like, well, it's not just now, it's always been this way, trying to meet anger with anger.
Mm-hmm.
Man, it's just a recipe for more volatility sometimes.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a domino effect and a vicious circle.
Hmm.
And I totally agree with you that when you share love, when you're in the moment, when you're mindful, live in a mindful way, everything's just so much brighter and so much better. And um, and trying to find how, like, I really have, as I've gotten older, appreciated the phrase "ignorance is bliss." Because I find, being an endangered species biologist or conservationist, because that's what I know. I I can see the devastation much
Hmm.
more clearly
Yeah,
than
exactly. Yeah.
somebody that maybe works on cars. Like, I
Right.
couldn't look at an engine and say, "Oh, that's in bad shape," but they could, because they know what
Yeah.
that engine works like. And
Right.
so I appreciate that phrase, "ignorance is bliss," and I oftentimes wish that I was really ignorant sometimes so that I didn't feel that grief. But
Yeah.
that's part of the job, though, is to say, "Hey, look, this is, we need to correct our course here, and we need to find that harmony that you were talking about, and being part of the circle again, and finding ways to build relationships." I mean, everything is about relationships. If the
Yeah.
relationship is broken, it just doesn't work. So how do we mend those and strengthen them and build them with bonds of love and respect and caring? And I think that's a way to go to help.
I agree. And it's like this thing of wild food. I think sometimes I tell them about my wild food practice, and I think people think like, oh, that's his thing. Like some people's thing is golf, and some people's
Hmm.
thing is
Hmm.
car racing or whatever. And it's like, it's a little different than that, because
Yeah.
to me, it's about those relationships to non-human persons, and
Yes.
those relationships help to have a more integrated understanding of this incredible planet that we were gifted with. I mean, we're gifted with so much, and it's amazing how much of it we've spent so needlessly. So, and like you were just saying, I mean, I understand when you have that ecological perspective, you take somebody fishing and they're like, oh my gosh, there's so many salmon here. It's like, no, there's not.
Right.
Trust me, there's not. Trying to like know when to say that and when not to, and trying to like keep my heart singing. But anyway, Barb, it's been awesome to talk to you. I really appreciate all the things that you're doing. And I hope that some of the women listening can get involved with the Gathering Society, because it seems like the right place for a
Yeah.
lot of people to be. It's really beautiful. And also, I'm going to get your book, your Manoomin book, because I've been seeing it forever, and I didn't realize. Now I know that's you. Also, I wanted to say that some of the videos that you made, that must be with Roger, who you were talking about before.
Yeah.
I've been
Mhm.
watching those actually for a while, and I didn't know that was you involved in it. But I've been watching the way they take, I think it's probably a forked piece of maple, and attach it to the pole that they use,
Oh,
the
yeah,
push
the
pole.
push poles.
Yes, I've been wanting to do that project at home. So just so you know, I'm going to be following that video along, and I think that's really cool. So anyway, all the
Yeah.
work that you do is so beautiful. So I really
Well, thanks.
appreciate what you're putting out in the world, and thank you for your time here today. I want to just give you the floor if there's any last things you want to say to the people listening.
Well, I certainly want to invite you out to Michigan to go racing,
Thank you.
and
Okay. I'd
I
love
could
to.
get you hooked up with our tribal folks here, and
Please. Thank you.
they could show you how they really do it. And I really do appreciate you inviting me on your show, and I just think it's great that you're bringing wild foods out to the world, and that relationship that exists between us all. And I wish you the best of luck as well in all your adventures, and look forward to talking with you again too.
Thank you so much. And tell us one more time, just for everybody listening, where they find all of you've got so much going on, but where do they find all of it?
Um, I would say go to my website, barbbarton.com. You can get books there, my music's there, information about my book tours when I'm doing them, when COVID's not around, and yeah, my film. That'd be the best place to go, barbbarton.com.
BarbBarton.com. We'll put that in our show notes and everything for people too. So,
Awesome.
Barb, thank you, and wishing you a really wonderful day.
Thank you, Daniel. You too.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.